Okay. So Richard Toews, the son of Mennonite immigrants who escaped the Russian Revolution, was born in Winnipeg to Isaac and Frieda Toews. Growing up in Winnipeg, Richard was heavily influenced by the Mennonite culture of his parents. Notions of peace and nonviolence were defining features of his growing up years. But youth gives way to adult questions, which lead him into the study of radical Christian socialist movements that exist to critique and undermine, if need be, institutions of power that exist to marginalize the other. This quest for understanding the principles of justice laid the foundation of his first award-winning film, a gold Remy from Houston International Short Film Festival called The Prodigal. It was also out of this program of study and learning that a great uncle asked the same questions about what it means to be just, which resulted for the great uncle joining the Bolsheviks in 1917. A revolutionary seed had been planted, which has borne the fruit of the novel, The Quiet in the Land, followed up by The Confession. And Richard also has a PhD that he can tell you a little bit more about as well. So on over to you, Richard.
Well, thank you, Laura. And I want to thank you to the Burnaby Writers Society for allowing me to do this. I'm very honored. And thank you to Susan. And it was a pleasure to hear her poetry. And she touched on two very prominent people in my experiences, Hildegard and Thomas Merton. Anyway, here is the book. Oh, whoa, yeah, that's the cover. I don't want to get into too much in terms of why I wrote the book, but I'd like to give a very, very short background. After I'd finished The Quiet in the Land, I was looking around for a novel or something to write, and somebody had come up with this information that the Mennonites there's evidence the Mennonites had colluded with the Nazis in Ukraine in the extermination of Jews. Now, to understand that, you have to understand the history, a little bit of the history. Mennonites had undergone severe persecution during the right after 1917. Right after 1917, Mennonites were deemed traitors and despised because they had a German tradition. Many of them had come from German-speaking countries in the under when Catherine the Great was the Tsarina. In fact, in World War I, the Mennonites in the Ukraine would welcome the German army into their homes and whatnot. They spoke the same language. They expressed some of the same traditions, and of course, Mennonites had been during the revolution had been severely persecuted. Now, post 1917, Stalin had established a program called kulakization. These were rich peasant farmers, and many of the Mennonites were kulakized. Their farms were taken away from them and amalgamated into collective farms. And if any Mennonite, they then would be kulakized, and that was basically a sentence of death. So, in fact, in my research to write this book, I came across a statement that Stalin wanted to do to the Mennonites what Hitler did to the Jews in Germany. Literally tens of thousands of Mennonites had died. So that in 1941, when Germany invaded Russia, Operation Barbarossa, the Mennonites saw the Germans as their liberators. I want to tell you about one man that I came across, one contact in the process of writing a novel, and I won't give you his name. He was about 15 when he met Himmler. His aunt, one of Himmler's assistants, this was in the colony of Hauptstadt. His aunt became one of Himmler's secretaries. Himmler took a liking to the young man, but of course the young man had to go. It was subsequently drafted into the, and he made two statements to me that were profoundly disturbing for me. He said to me, well, he says, you know, we love that man. Him, speaking of him, we would have done anything for him. And I said, anything? He said, yes, anything. And then he said, if it wasn't for Hitler, I would be dead. Sorry if I'm getting a little emotional. And I turned to him and I says, yes. And if it wasn't for Hitler, I might be speaking to one of the survivors of the 6 million. So let me get in, I have some sections that I've decided that I'd like to read, and I'll try to stay within the time frame. Cornelius's early memories were of a time when Ukraine was a gentle place of soft summer days and winds tenderly touching the expansive wheat fields. It was as if the grass had become an undulating sea, a time when the sun turned the wheat into fields of gold. Men with horses would head out into the fields with their scythes. Nettie Friesen, barefoot, led her cows to pasture, and men returned home for the evening meal. Later, hymns were sung around the supper table to the sound of guitars. Boys too young to mow the fields played in the Tukmak River. Girls learned how to be good Mennonite wives. It was an innocent time for the Mennonites, a prosperous time. They had made Russia rich with the price of their grain. The people were fed and sated. Yes, there were stories of peasant unrest with the Mennonite masters, stories of some Mennonite farmers and factory owners treating the peasants as nothing more than objects for use, something too cruel to talk about, but these are just stories, or so it was said. For the most part, Ukraine had blessed the Mennonites. They lived in peace, living out their faith. Under Catherine, they were known as the quiet in the land, a people in the world, but not of it. They were the silent ones, the separate ones. But now with the war and revolution over, with Russia lying in ruins, Germany in defeat, and Stalin in his place, that glorious time was over. The herds were lowing as they crowded at the village gate, rising a cloud of bronze dust in the evening sun, setting over the hills and the expansive grasslands. Cornelius went out to the field to bring his cattle home. A pale bluish shadow spread over the land. Above the darkening village of Niederhauptstadt, faint stars began to kindle. The sound of the village gradually died away. Only a few villagers gathered on the earth embankments of their houses. The night was fresh and still. Cornelius was pleasantly held captive by the memories and images of the past. The full silvery moon sailed out from behind the dark poplars and grew along one side of the village square. In the windows of the houses, lights were burning. The air was laden with the smell of the evening dew and a medley of voices and laughter. By the fences and the houses, white kerchiefs gleamed in the darkness. Mr. Warkentine made an appearance. He was an old warrior with old stories. He was one of the rare survivors of the great 1718. He was an enormous man with a sturdy build, whose red-brown face, with its bushy snow-white beard, was furrowed by heavy lines and wrinkles. His legs, arms, and shoulders displayed the fine muscular development of a younger man. There were deep scars on his head under the short-cropped hair. His thick, sinewy neck was checkered with crisscross folds like the neck of a bruised and scratched. How many Bolsheviks met their fate after meeting Mr. Warkentine? Cornelius wondered. Seeing Mr. Warkentine triggered within Cornelius a different memory of a time in between, a time made fulgent by death, and yet in that space of death There were moments in which we were touched by grace that only comes when light pierces the night. For the briefest of time, there was the appearance of peace sandwiched between two unimaginable epochs of famine. Death's shadow covered us as if under Athon's outstretched wings to feed on Prometheus's liver. It was Dante's Inferno come to visit us. Old women sitting half conscious on the ground, dazed by their hunger, their misery, and their misfortune. Pallid young mothers seeking to feed dying babies from their milkless breasts. To think of the possibility of hope, the possibility of grace, of light breaking into the darkness of hell might appear to some readers as obscene, and yet it is for moments of hope that grace does, indeed, forestall the occasion of suicide, both physical and emotional. For Cornelius, it was the spark of seeing Mr. Work, the briefest moments of his life. For Cornelius, Mr. Workentine awakened the memory of his father, how to fish. There are two villages that I'm in the novel. One is Fedorovka. It's the Russian village river called Tokmak, to which you can cross over by a bridge, and the other village is Niederhauptstadt. Now, this is a little definition, a little description of the shtetl Fedorovka. Somewhere between heaven and hell, there was the Jewish shtetl of Fedorovka. As in Jewish shtetls of that time, both Jews and Russians lived together. I will let you decide for yourselves to which of the two, heaven or hell, Fedorovka is more akin. I must confess, I often wondered as I pondered the same question whether God had taken his leave of the place or simply forgot. Whenever I visited Fedorovka, Cornelius said to me one afternoon, it seemed, or maybe it's my eyes a leaden gray, and the wind tore at the trees, flinging branches hither and yon. Garbage was strewn everywhere at the whim of the wind. Fedorovka was always noisy and muddled. Cornelius spoke passionately, with gestures befitting an overzealous Italian. Can you imagine it, Abraham? The narrow streets wound through the town as if it were a cluttered maze. Broken wagons lie about, horse harnesses here and there. I shook my head in amazed bewilderment with a hint of wonder, incomprehension, incredulity. One might wonder if the horses were ever joined to the wagons, said Cornelius. How sad it was to see the blackened frames, which were once houses. In the ditches, my goodness, rusted plows turned over. Of what use were they when rusting and overturned? And the weeds, my God, the weeds, for they grew better than everything else. Not a house had a fence that was of any use. Beds, garbage piled up against the fences. Perhaps the only function was the fences kept out the garbage. Always mud, muddy in the spring, dusty in the summer. It was easy to understand going into Fedorovka why we looked down on the Russians. There was no sense of respect for themselves. Perhaps that is what they truly are, wild and untamable, the inscrutable Russian. They are an unfathomable mystery. It is enough to make one. One of the main characters in the novel, his name is Isaac. Isaac is a Mennonite. He befriends a Jew, the Jewish cobbler in Fedorovka. And of course, doing so, he generates a lot of ire amongst neighbors, and particularly the Mennonite pastor. That they see this as inviting some severe problems, particularly when it comes to the way the Germans took their acceptance of that particular issue. By this time in the novel, the Germans had already invaded Russia. Isaac was not unfamiliar with Stalin's prisons. In 1924, Isaac had been arrested for hiding grain. A neighbor, Mr. Nicholas Sawatsky, had come to him at night and asked for grain. Isaac had none to give. Nonetheless, his neighbor reported him to David Grable. David sent his brigade. David Grable is another Mennonite. David sent his brigade to Isaac's home. It was late. They stormed into Isaac's home without notice and turned the house inside out. They found no grain, At Isaac's trial, Mr. Sawatsky recanted. He told the court that he had made the whole thing up because he was angry with Isaac. No matter, Isaac spent 8 years in a Kazakhstan prison. You could see the breath a mile away. In the silence and the speeches of the blind, in the medley of people bound together by the same grief, terror, and hope, in this hatred and lack of understanding between men who spoke the same tongue, you could see much of the tragedy of the 20th century. In some sick, perverted way, the status of a prisoner in the Gulag was associated with a degree of honor. While it was the end result of a parody on the law, the last thing prison was associated with was justice. Its overtone was refusal to pay homage to tyranny. These men who dared to stand the ground were in that company of brothers, men such as Osip Mandelstam, Isaac Babel. Although Babel paid the ultimate price for supposedly being a spy and shooting an NKVD man, he had never held a gun in his life. Varlam Shalamanov. The thing about prison, said Isaac, is that it obscures all sense of time. A man can lie in his cell for 25 years and yet think he has been there but a minute. He can have been there just a day or two, but it seems to him a lifetime. Isaac was sentenced to 8 years, a mere meets the devil and Christ in the same sentence, he said to Moshe. One night, as he sat on the bank, said to Moshe one night as he sat on the banks of the Tokmak looking up at the clear night sky. Stars, infinite stars. You and I, said Moshe, we sit here together, weep and weep, hoping, longing for Jerusalem. Isaac nodded his head and smiled. There was something even in this place, in this time, that settled upon the two a sense of well-being. In prison, Moshe, you are an animal. Isaac was still. Moshe was silent, waiting for his friend. In prison, I met with your ruach. We were nothing but zirks. They worked us to the bone for hours. Many starved, many died from overwork and no food. Our clothes were rags. Inmates died of disease, always fights over food. Some prisoners hoarded basic items, tobacco, food, sewing needles, and even shoes and sweaters were traded within an intimate and often lethal hierarchy. Protection was bought, there was gambling, debts were paid in blood, people murdered over the simplest pretext, over nothing. Food was used as a weapon. It was a way to control the population. The guards controlled every part of our lives, our very existence. If a guard was in a good mood, that would determine how much a prisoner would get to eat. Our work, by hand we dug a canal. Stalin wanted his canal, I tell you, Moshe. It was the dead that dug the canal. It was the dead that paid for the canal, and the dead were simply dumped in a ditch, covered with dirt from the diggings and then flooded over. It was convenient. They say 12,000 died. I don't know. It's a big number. The guards were inhuman, but more inhuman were those who were really in control. The gangs, criminals, murderers, thieves, rapists. They were truly the ones in control. Even the guards feared them. They controlled every part of our lives. They controlled who did hard labor, who slept where, who got food. It was the gangs that determined the punishment. I tell you, Moshe, I have seen the devil, and he doesn't have a long tail and horns, but his breath, mein Gott, the punishment was swift and unforgiving. Do you think the devil would be so vile? I have no idea what it was that I did. I was beaten, and then Isaac lifted his shirt and revealed a long, deep scar. Moshe looked at the scar, touched it, but said nothing. His face grimaced. That said it all. Murder was common, certainly being deprived of food. Peter Janssen, another Mennonite in prison with me, died of starvation. But the best one of all, that's Stalin. He is a shrewd one. To clear a minefield. If one blew himself up, he had atoned for his crime. If a prisoner refused, the solution was simple. The soldiers were simply ordered to shoot him. It was too much for them, for Isaac to remember, and Moshe to hear. Again they sat in silence. Isaac looked up at the stars. He breathed, and then in a wistful tone he said, that in prison you never see the stars. A splash. A fish jumped near the rock on which they were sitting. Across the river, the yellow lights of Fedorovka flickered. They could hear the shouting from drunken men stumbling home from taverns. Moshe said nothing. He fidgeted uncomfortably as he sat on the rock. I love sitting here at night with you, said Isaac. I love to look up at the stars, the heavens. Do you know? She shook his head. When I look up at the night sky, I feel so small, good way. I feel as though I am part of something so big, so infinitely big, something that allows me to participate in it. My smallness tells me that all I am required to live, to recognize that I am alive, that I am blessed. Yes, blessed, even in this hell, but even more. The delusion of dead power is the fleeting contingency on its ability to take life. But in my insignificance, I grace a power far surpassing the dead power of tyranny, for the simple reason that when I gaze into the night sky, I am filled with completely in awe of the fact that as I sit here under the stars looking up, bound with the idea that all this was made with me in it out of nothing. God made this for the simple reason that it overwhelmed him with the joy of it. Tyranny can only exist as a pretense of power. It has an ability to create. Power is the ability to bring into being, to live for the simple reason of the joy of it, for the love of it. The evil of Stalin's put there to force us into some macabre, monstrous degeneration, but because their existence is contingent on one principle and one principle only, to beat out of us any vestige of wonder comes from love. I don't know what my time frame is. I have one more section.
Oh yeah, you're good. You got.
I'm good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Same thing, about another 5-ish minutes.
Okay, then.
You might have a bit more, actually.
Okay. At night, as night wrapped around its veil, because it's a novel, I can do all sorts of things. Like you can have conversations with people that haven't even been alive yet. That's the beauty of fiction. So here we are. As the night wrapped its veil around Cornelius, he was visited by Dante. Cornelius spoke to him, and Dante answered. Remember my words, Cornelius, he whispered, but only loud enough for Cornelius's conscience to hear. I, too, was in a dark wood. Midway in my life, I was in a dark wood. All sense of right was lost to me. Nothing made sense to me. How could I speak of it? It was too heavy a weight. It wore me down. It tore my spirit. Exhausted, I went astray. I tried to find God, but only found variations of the devil who taunted me, laughed at me, that I thought even in hell one could find God. Then Dante said to Cornelius, I would never have found my way. You need a guide. Cornelius had been reading Dostoevsky. Would he be Cornelius's guide? Would he show Cornelius the way through this dark wood? Would he help Cornelius understand and know God? Would he help Cornelius with the most important of all human needs, trust? It was in a dream he came to Cornelius. He asked, think. When there's pain and wounds, physical agony, and all this distracts the mind from mental suffering, so that one is tormented only by the wounds until the moment of death. But the most terrible agony may not be in the wounds themselves, but in knowing for certain that within an hour, within 10 minutes, then within half a minute, now at this very instant, your soul will leave your body, and you will no longer be a person. And that is certain. The worst thing is that it is certain. Tell me, Cornelius asked Dostoevsky, does torture then cause one to willingly stop living? Some say that the evil of torture is that you wish for death, that to live is unnatural. It is a life out of order. Do you remember when the Grand Inquisitor confronted Christ in my novel Brothers Karamazov? Do you remember what he said? The great lie is that the secret human consists in living, but in what one lives for. Christ offered freedom. The devil offered bread. Freedom was of less value, is of less value than bread. That is what the devil offers. Without a firm idea of what he is to live for, man will not consent to live and will sooner destroy himself than remain on earth, even though all around him there be loaves. That, when it comes down to it, men would really choose bread over freedom, and even that, in the end, men would choose to throw away freedom. You are troubled, says Jean. Cornelius looked up. He saw before him the scepter of Jean Emery. He was real enough, though a conscience come to trouble Cornelius, the last voice to visit him, a voice from the future, one who had lived through it, one who had participated in the organized resistance against the Nazi occupation of Belgium, which resulted in Jean's detainment and torture by the German Gestapo at Fort Brendock, and several years later of imprisonment in concentration camps. He had survived internments in Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, only to commit suicide when it was all over. He could tell Cornelius exactly what those bodies in the hut experienced. In the camps, they prepare you, said Jean. The prisoner is given up by his comrades. No longer is there room in one's conscience for the contrast of good or bad, noble or base, intellectual or unintellectual. The prisoner, those who come to the hut, he is a staggering corpse, sinister. Those of us who are spared, we exclude such a one from our consciousness. We have no choice, because we know that to consider him is to recognize that we may be the next one. Torture makes something banal of death. When torture is treated as though it is an essential part of this life, there is nothing banal in this evil. It is the most pervasive attack on the human spirit. That is Dr. Clausen's goal, to attack and destroy human dignity, to give the impression that human dignity is irrelevant. It is an With that, Dr. Clausen has achieved the ultimate goal of torture, the loss of trust. Trust in the world, trust in what one has always held us to as sacred, held as knowable, predictable. Torture strips that away, and nothing then can be. Oh, everything is shifted out of order. All perception is newly regarded as a lie. Now even the events of the torture are taken as normal. So the prisoner comes to expect torture as a natural phenomena. Death then is the logical conclusion. It is expected as an absolute. They wait, sometimes patiently, expecting the next round to be the one that will bring about their natural conclusion. If death is not forthcoming, there is an impatience for it. Are we not fully human that we should not die? Asks the prisoner. In the end, it is not the individual that is nullified, but humankind. To continue to live is tantamount to declaring that the prisoner is not fully human. The prisoner has not reached their goal, their full capacity. And the torturer? He performs his duty as his most blasé manner possible, for he has not confronted a human, but an object. What does he have to invest in an object? Nothing. He can sit, smoke a cigarette, read a magazine to the sound of torture. Cornelius sat in stunned silence. There was nothing to say to Jean. "You're troubled?" said Jean. "Yes, yes, yes." Jean was quiet for a moment. "That is a good thing," he said. "Good? It is good, yes. It is good because now you know." "Why did you have to tell me?" Again, Jean was quiet. He gave his next answer a good deal of thought. "I tell you this because, as I just told you, now you know. Now you have an obligation. Now you must tell what you know. You have knowledge. Now your words can serve as a warning to those who might so easily fall victim to the illusion that comes with submission without fully comprehending what it is one submits to the illusion of a false reality." And that's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Richard. That was, it's, I don't know anything about the Mennonites, and I didn't realize the connection there, not just, with Stalin, but also with Hitler and the Nazis.
It was it's probably, it took me 3 years to write. It was probably the 3 hardest years of my life.
Wow.
I still, every time I read it, I think, well, hey, I'm over it. I've got it all I've got the emotion under control. I don't.
It's too emotional of a
As a dear
yeah.
friend of mine, you've lived in a toxic world for 3 years, and before that, you wrote the novel *The Quiet in the Land*, which is also very troubling. So he said, for 6 years, you need help, and he was right. He was right. Yeah, he was right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a lot to take in. Yeah, especially when you have such a
I
personal
can say this, that I never want to write another book like this, ever. It took too much out of me.
Yeah,
Too much suffering.
Can't even imagine.
Well, I had the support of the Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Shoah Foundation in LA. They've been very supportive in this project. So I got a lovely letter saying, your book will be your book will be an important contribution to the ongoing discussion of the Holocaust.
Yeah, exactly. So people don't forget. We always remember that. Oh.
Well, I wrote this at a time when, like, today in 2021, we have witnessed some horrific things that we really need to pay attention to, not just, but the social issues, the politics of what's going on. We are living in, I think Camus once said, the plague actually in the plague. He wrote, the plague bacillus never dies. It just simply goes into hiding. And it knows exactly when the right time to reemerge. And he's not talking, when he's talking about the plague bacillus, he's not talking about the Spanish flu. I mean, he's writing, his response was to what happened in France and in Europe because of fascism. So that's it for me. I'm not. No more preaching. No more preaching.
Oh no! It was what a history lesson.